Hey guys, and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about England, the Vikings, and the Battle of Hastings. So, the last time we talked about England, it had been taken over by the Romans. And if you remember, Hadrian kind of founded London and made the Hadrian's Wall, which separated England and Scotland. Well, when Rome falls, the Romans leave. They can't sustain it anymore. And someone calls the Anglos and the Saxons take over. These were people from Northern Europe, and they have this story called Beowulf. And Beowulf, I have the video I want you guys to watch. Beowulf is the inspiration for so many stories that we have even today in America. Beowulf inspired Skyrim, Dark Souls, and even The Lord of the Rings. Well, The Lord of the Rings was written not in America, but you know what I mean. So I want you guys to watch Beowulf. Beowulf is the longest surviving Anglo-Saxon poem. It is probably about Denmark, though, which is kind of interesting. We think about Beowulf, we think about English people, but it was probably from this area, which was where the Anglo-Saxons kind of were before they ended up going into Britain. And it's compared to the Iliad, the story of heroism and valor for the Greeks. So it's a pretty interesting piece of literature. And I want to include it because, once again, our final paper is going to be on any type of art, a painting, a book, a poem, and what it says about the society that made it. So if you're interested in Beowulf, then that might be a good thing for you to choose. So England, as the England that we know, begins with this person, St. Augustine of Canterbury. And St. Augustine was a Roman monk, and he lived at a monastery in Rome. He took his vows in Rome. And Pope Gregory I asks him to go on a mission. A mission is when someone from a certain religion has to go somewhere and try to convert people to that religion. And Pope Gregory asks him to go to England on a mission. And he says to turn Angles to angels. So again, England was Anglo-Saxon, so to turn the Anglos to angels. And so St. Augustine reluctantly goes. I say reluctantly because as they're going, Augustine sends multiple letters to Pope Gregory saying, I don't want to do this doesn't feel safe. At the time, people thought that England was all barbarians, especially after the Romans leave when Rome falls. So let me add a date here. Hold on. So St. Augustine goes and he ends up establishing a monastery in England and starts to spread the idea of Christianity. Christianity is evolving, as you guys can see. It's evolving from something that was openly persecuted to something that's tolerated. Then we have Clovis and Charlemagne becoming Christian leaders. And now we have Christian missionaries going to places to try to spread Christianity. After St. Augustine goes, about 70 years later, someone named Bede goes. Bede the scholar, also known as the Venerable Bede. And he was a really, really important scholar in even modern history. He wrote a Latinized version of the Bible, which was in Hebrew, and people still use this version of the Bible today. He also wrote the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, which is a history of the churches in England. So, what's kind of interesting, why I bring this up, is that Bede writes this in 731, but St. Augustine had just gotten to England in the 600s, which just goes to show how rapidly England becomes kind of Christianized. I want to make one other note here before we move on to the Vikings about Ireland. Ireland was never invaded by Rome, so Ireland becomes kind of its own place. We have the Celtic way of life, the Celts, and eventually we have Irish Catholicism, which is different from Catholicism at the time, so we would call that a schism. Again, just like with Islam, a schism is a big rift, like a big breaking. But moving on, I want to talk to you guys about the Vikings. So this is a map of Europe, and the Vikings begin in this area called Scandinavia. And the Vikings revolutionized water travel. The Vikings had these boats that were really unique because they could travel on rivers or in the ocean. So the Vikings begin exploring the world. They go into this broken up, destroyed Roman Empire by the rivers, and they start to take over and to plunder. The Vikings came about during the Carolingian Empire after Charlemagne's death, and they began, like I said, to raid, destroy, and pillage. You would hear stories about what the Vikings would do, and this was on purpose. The Vikings would destroy an area, and they would leave a couple survivors, and they would say, "Go tell people what we did here." And so the Vikings were extremely feared, and we call them the Nordic people sometimes, the Norsemen, because they were from Scandinavia, which was in northern Europe. And a Viking just means someone who lurks in a Vic, which is like a watery bay area. Now, the goals that they had, as I have here on this side, this photo, Scandinavia is not an easy place to live. It's not like the Russian tundra, but it's very cold and frozen over sometimes. There's a level of permafrost, even. So the Vikings had an environmental goal when they set out to conquer places. They wanted to get resources that they could live off of and that they could bring back to their kind of frozen environment. So the Vikings would go on these boats with these huge crews, conquer places, and then they would have the resources from those places. They liked to conquer monasteries. And this was another reason why the Vikings were really hated and feared. Why would you conquer a monastery? Remember, Rome is a broken up, destroyed, fallen apart, crumbled plate. A bunch of missing pieces everywhere. Monasteries are the only places where there is still some life. And so the monasteries do have food and water. They also have some important relics. So, for example, a monastery might have some gold. They might have some, silver and shields that they have kept and they're going to study, or something that's been donated to them, which we'll get into a little bit later, how the money works with these monasteries. Another reason why you might conquer them is if we think back to our Benedictine rule, if you were a monk, you couldn't fight. You would just have to let the Vikings in. Monasteries didn't have swords or anything like that. They were basically free reign. Okay. Again, just a note on these ships, they were really shallow. The rivers were really shallow, so these boats had to be able to maneuver through the ocean and also rivers. And how they ended up doing this was they make a rudder system. So a rudder is how do you describe a rudder? A rudder is like a thing on the back of a boat that helps steer it. So you'd have all of these men rowing, and you wouldn't have to steer by a sail. You would steer by this rudder system. Let me get a picture of a rudder for you guys. Here, so this is a rudder. It's a thing in the back of the boat that you put down in the water, and then it helps you steer. So another note about their weapons and tactics is that they were not a professional army. They were erratic. They fought they would just go in and just conquer and start killing people. They didn't have a formation, and like I said, the boats were 60 people. So these 60 men were like a mini army. So they could do more sneaky things. They could, one half, 30 people are going to do a surprise attack, and the other 30 are going to push the victims into a trap that the other 30 are kind of hiding for their sneak attack. Again, the Vikings killed and captured people, and they had this idea, this is actually where we get this phrase, of going berserk. So these men thought that, because they were polytheistic, if you've ever heard of Thor or Odin or Loki even, or if you've ever played God of War. So Odin is kind of like the Zeus level of the gods, the Norse gods. And people that went berserk thought that Odin was kind of like going through them. Like Odin was going to protect you, and you could go just like insane, killing people with no regard for your life, because Odin was going to be kind of watching over you. So that's where we get the term berserk from. And the last note I want to make on the weapons and tactics is that the Vikings did not have horns on their helmets. There have been many different excavations, and there is no evidence that the Vikings had horns on their helmets. So that's some background on the Vikings. And what I want to go to next is this area of northern France called Normandy. Normandy is really important strategically because it is on the edge of the ocean, and it also has access to some really important rivers. And like I said, the Vikings love traveling on the rivers. Normandy is also close to England, across the English Channel. So we have England, and here is modern day France, and this is the top. So the Vikings are raiding France, and they tried to raid Paris, actually. And in return for leaving Paris alone, the Frankish king ends up giving the Vikings Normandy. They say, you know what, just leave us alone, and you can have northern France, Normandy. The Vikings are really happy because, like I said, this was a really strategic area. And it's also really a beautiful area. So this is a really famous place for tourism. It used to be a St. Benedictine monastery, but what's interesting is it actually floods and becomes a little island. So I'll show you guys this as a tourism video. So the Vikings are settling in northern France and they become French. They learn French, they marry French women, they really embrace the culture. And this wasn't the only place they did that. They also embraced living in England. So the Vikings weren't able to control England after a couple different battles with the Saxons. The Saxons were eventually able to kick out the Vikings, the Viking like rulers, but left a bunch of Viking settlers. And that becomes a problem a little bit later. So here we have the Anglo-Saxons. This is where the Vikings are from, but now many Vikings are settling in Normandy. And there becomes an issue with the English throne. So a childless king, Edward the Confessor, dies, and he has no clear heir. The question is, who is going to be the king? Like I said, the Vikings had tried to take over England, and there was a bunch of Viking settlers, and people were starting to marry some Vikings. And so a person named William the Bastard, he's from Normandy, France. He's called William the Bastard because his dad was the king of Normandy, but didn't marry his mom. He was like having an affair with William's mom. And so he wasn't a what we would call the legitimate child back then. But nonetheless, after his dad dies, William is treated like the regular king. People don't treat him any different. And then we have Harold, who is the Earl of Wessex. Now, this is a lineage problem, a lineage like who's going to be the next ruler. So I'm going to show you guys this genealogy chart. We don't need to know all of these people for the sake of this class. We just don't need to. What you do need to know is Edward the Confessor had a kind of trusted advisor, the Earl Godwin, and his son was Harold. And so when Edward the Confessor dies, the idea is that Harold's going to be the king. But Edward also has distant cousin, William the Bastard, and William has a pretty legitimate like blood claim to the throne. In fact, Edward the Confessor says that William the Bastard is going to be the next king of England. Harold is not happy about this. So, Harold is crowned king, and William is furious. So, he decides to take his army and he is going to fight Harold for the throne. And as you could have maybe guessed from this family tree, he's not named Edward or William the Bastard anymore. His name is William the Conqueror. William ends up going to England, and there is a really interesting battle called the Battle of Hastings that takes place. What is cool about the Battle of Hastings is two things. One, how it's won, the type of weaponry that they used, and two, that it is extremely detailed on this thing called the Bayeux Tapestry, which is a piece of embroidery that was most likely made by women. So I had us analyzing the Bayeux Tapestry as homework. I'm going to delete that homework. Instead, I want for you to watch two videos. We have one on the Battle of Hastings from the BBC, and another is this really cool rendition of the battle kind of like coming alive on the tapestry, which is pretty cool. Our next class, we're going to be talking about the Dark Ages and if they were truly dark. So that's all for today.